Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So on Monday I responded to a video that was titled 5 Things I Hate About D&D 5th Edition, and what I found is I didn't have the same reaction to the items the content creator listed in his video. I mentioned in the reaction that I don't actually hate anything about D&D. I mean, if I did, I probably wouldn't play the game. The fact is I love playing D&D and I play several times a week. However, that said, there are certainly things about D&D I'm not fond of, and none of them were brought up in that video. So I figured I'd do a follow-up video where I talk about the 5 things that I, and big air quotes here, hate about D&D 5e. I'm not sure there's any specific order here. These are just 5 things I wish D&D did better. And to respond to a lot of comments on Monday's video, I don't hate reactions. A lot of people saw the title of that video and thought that I was listing 5 things I hate about D&D, and specifically I was going to talk about reactions because it was a reaction video. I don't mind reactions, but there are 5 things I definitely came up with really easily that I'm not particularly fond about in D&D. And the first one I'm going to talk about is feats. Now, as I mentioned on Monday, it doesn't bother me that feats are optional. I play with feats all the time, but giving the players an option not to use them, that doesn't bother me in the slightest. It also doesn't bother me that you either select an ability score increase or a feat. I mean, that just means that when you get an ability score increase, you have more options than if it was only usable to increase an ability score or only usable to select a feat. Here's what bothers me about feats. Some of them are massively powerful. I mean, so powerful that certain character types have no option but to get them as soon as possible. And then there's other feats that are absolute trash. The balance of feats in D&D is one of the poorest game design examples we see in this entire game. And ability score bonuses are few and far between. I mean, usually you're waiting about 4 levels for each one, and then you get it, and you should be using this rare occurrence to select one of several options to customize your character the way you want to. But in reality, some feats are just so overwhelmingly good that you don't really have a selection at all. Like, you're playing an archer. Then you must select sharpshooter. It's dramatically better than a plus 2d or dexterity score, or the piercer feat, or any other option you could choose to customize your character through feat selection, with one exception, and that's the crossbow expert feat. In fact, if you are playing an archer, if you want to be optimized at all, except for very specific builds, you really need both feats. And that means for most classes, you're waiting until level 8 to get both of them, unless you play a variant human or custom lineage, in which case you can get them both at level 4, half as many levels. This kind of interaction is why we see so many variant human and custom lineage optimized builds. And what that leads to is you wait until high level before you actually make any real decisions for ability score increases or actual feat selection, since the power of these feats essentially makes your decisions for you. So what it ends up being in practice is it's kind of like not getting your ability score increases at all, or perk selection at all. You get required feat number 1 at this level, then required feat number 2 at this level, and you may not even reach the level where you get another selection. And instead of customizing characters, it instead leads to cookie cutter characters. Melee characters using halberds, glaives, or spears, ranged characters using hand crossbows, and feats like durable, charger, dungeon delver, grappler, linguist, weapon master, and many, many more. We just don't see them. Like, they're just taking up space in our rulebooks. And if someone does select them due to inexperience or just wanting to be different, for that, they can expect to be overshadowed in play. This is how dramatic feat selection becomes. Ideally, what I would like is a feat system where every feat is relatively balanced against each other and approximately similar in value to a +2 in your primary ability score. A couple other things I'd like. Honestly, I would think that if feats are similar in value to a +2 in your primary ability score, then maybe we should get more feats. Like, fighters get a couple more feats, rogues get a couple more feats, but maybe it should be even more dramatic than that. And that brings us to number 2. And the wording for some of the rules is a big number 2. The designers talk about using quote-unquote natural language, in that words mean what you think they mean. Except they don't, because not all the rules are written with natural language. For example, the rules talk about difficult terrain. Difficult terrain means that the terrain is difficult to move through. But not all terrain that is difficult to move through is difficult terrain. So the plant growth spell definitely makes terrain that's difficult to move through, like really difficult, but it's not difficult terrain. This means that if we have naturally overgrown terrain, which is technically difficult terrain, then we cast plant growth in that area, suddenly the rules start giving us weird results because we start stacking terrain that is difficult to move through and difficult terrain. And we're still just talking about an area where the plants are overgrown. And here's another one. The rules talk about making an attack with a melee weapon. The rules also talk about making a melee weapon attack. Now, you see them on your screen. If you read these, they should be obviously synonymous. And I say they should be obviously synonymous because in D&D, they mean entirely different things. If you make an unarmed strike in D&D, it is a melee weapon attack, but it isn't an attack with a melee weapon. There are 4 kinds of attacks in D&D. A melee weapon attack, a ranged weapon attack, a melee spell attack, and a ranged spell attack. Every attack in the game is one of these types of attacks, even if the attack doesn't use a weapon or a spell. While an attack with a melee weapon requires you use an actual melee weapon, this isn't describing the type of attack. Instead, it's describing what you're making the attack with. So, let's say you have a spear, and you decide you're going to throw the spear using the thrown property. So we throw it. Is it an attack with a melee weapon? Yes, because a spear is a melee weapon. Is it a melee weapon attack? No. Is it an attack with a ranged weapon? No. Is it a ranged weapon attack? Yes. That's inane. There's nothing natural about that language at all. And I am constantly having to explain to people the difference between a melee weapon attack and an attack with a melee weapon. And I feel like such an idiot explaining why these two things that obviously should mean the same thing actually mean different things. It's ridiculous. That brings us to number 3, magic items. So first off, the crafting rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide are a train wreck. So what they did is they released another set of crafting rules in Xanathar's Guide to Everything. And guess what? Those are a train wreck too. So you either don't use the crafting rules at all, or you use these awful rules, or you do what most groups that really want to use crafting do, and you homebrew it. And with homebrew, of course, it's not playtested, so you don't even know if it's going to be a train wreck as well. And there's the, and I'll use this term loosely, rules for buying and selling magic items. The Dungeon Master's Guide is supposed to give the Dungeon Master the tools they need to run the game, but the rules for buying and selling magic items basically say that you can't buy or sell magic items unless you can, in which case that rare magic item might be valued at 501 gold pieces or maybe 5,000 gold pieces. And the Dungeon Master is given no additional tools, just told, figure it out. I find I just don't use buying or selling of magic items because the rules for them are terrible. And I've looked at all kinds of homebrew and tested all kinds of homebrew, and I've never found any that really works. And that's probably because the design of magic items is terrible too. It seems to me the magic item design itself seems to have been largely determined by chimpanzees on typewriters. Like, the base structure is fine, and it's there. Common items should be less powerful than uncommon items, which should be less powerful than rare items, and items that let you do unusual things should probably require attunement. And that is how it's presented, but they didn't follow those guidelines. A +1 weapon is uncommon, but the vastly inferior vicious weapon, well, that's rare. Like what? And attunement. Do they flip a coin? Rooms of flying, bowls of commanding water elementals, rings of 3 wishes, sentinel shields. How are these no attunement? Like, what exactly is the factor the designers use to determine if something needs attunement? I have no idea what it is. What I do know is the lack of consistency on the requirement of attunement makes pretty much any system for buying and selling magic items problematic. That's why I haven't found any homebrew that works. So magic items, you pretty much have to be really careful as a DM figuring out when to give them out, which items to give out, and to whom, and the Dungeon Master's Guide doesn't help us with it. Then we get to number 4. The rules telling you what the concept of your character is. A druid won't wear metal armor. So there's nothing saying they can't wear metal armor, or that they have some kind of penalty if they wear metal armor. Those things aren't covered. Instead, you are told what your character will and won't do, and the assumption is you will follow that command. Paladin oaths are basically the same. Here's a list of things your character has to do. But defining who your character is conceptually doesn't stop with just the mechanical rules. We are told in the rulebook, a warlock is defined by a pact with an otherworldly being. We are told that barbarians consider civilization a sign of weakness, and they are uncomfortable when hedged in by walls or crowds. We are told that a ranger's calling is to defend the outskirts of civilization. And the rules do not make it clear whether these are suggestions, or examples, or requirements. So if you come up with a character concept that isn't one of these cookie-cutter classes, then technically speaking, we do need the DM to approve using the mechanics of the Warlock class when we don't have a pact with an otherworldly being. I think there's value in giving players ideas, like telling us what the stereotypical ranger is like, so players have an idea as to what kind of features they can expect from the class. But these should be presented as stereotypes, rather than written down like you have 13 character concepts to select from. Now, I'll give 5th edition a bit of credit here. Previous editions were worse, but there is still a ways to go to let players choose who their character is and have the rules tell us how that works mechanically. That brings us to the 5th item I think D&D could do way better. Spells. Now, don't get me wrong, I love playing spellcasters in D&D. I think D&D does a good job of making spells seem really fantastical, but there is a whole lot that really just needs redesign. Now, the first problem is just like with feats. Some options are just dramatically superior to others. Now, maybe I should be grateful because I kind of built my current career separating the bad spell options from the good ones. But you shouldn't need to read the spell find traps to know it doesn't actually find traps. And you shouldn't need to read the see invisibility spell and then read the invisibility condition and then notice an inconsistency to realize that you still get disadvantage to attack invisible creatures for some weird reason. And clerics shouldn't have to select spirit guardians to be effective. Wizards shouldn't have to select the shield spell, and druids shouldn't have to select conjure animals. If spells were better balanced against each other, each spell selection would be a way to define your character in a unique way instead of spirit guardians feeling like a cleric class feature instead of a selection from many options. There are 25 third level cleric spells, but every cleric seems to take spirit guardians, and if they don't, they'll probably regret it. But it's not just the balance of the spells against each other that's a problem. Class features seem to scale with a linear progression, but spells, they scale exponentially. A 9th level spell is not 1/9 more powerful than an 8th level spell. A 3rd level spell is often more than twice as good as a 2nd level spell. So what happens is, naturally, high level spellcasters become really, really powerful. And generally speaking, more powerful than non-spellcasting or partial spellcasting classes. Now, it used to be, in previous editions, that spellcasters were quite weak at low levels, and then powerful at high levels. So there was kind of this give and take for selecting a spellcaster in a system where spellcasters eventually become the most powerful. But that's really not the case anymore. A character with Eldritch Blast and Agonizing Blast is doing similar damage to a non-casting weapon user, but they get the spell slots too. In order to create any kind of balance between spellcasters and non-spellcasters, the system incorporates features on monsters that shut down the most powerful spells. So Wall of Force can win a fight without a saving throw, so we'll make sure the higher challenge monsters can often teleport. Hypnotic Pattern can shut down groups of enemies, so we'll make sure higher challenge monsters are often immune to charm. So instead of actually balancing spellcasters with non-spellcasters, instead we just make sure spellcasters can be shut down. I mean, it is a solution, I guess, but it's not a great one. And if class balance was something that actually existed in the game, you wouldn't need a solution. Now, once again, I'll give 5th edition credit. I think it is better than previous editions in terms of having non-spellcasters still be at least relevant at higher levels. But honestly, if it was me designing the game, I think spellcasters would be able to cast more spells, but these spells would be better balanced against each other and overall less powerful than they currently are. I'm not saying you, the viewer, would or should prefer that, but I would. So there it is, 5 things I, air quote, hate about D&D. These are all problems I have with this game. But despite those problems, in my opinion, D&D is the most fun game for me to play currently. So I live with the problems and just hope that in the next iteration, they handle these things a bit better. Role-playing games are never perfect, but ideally, each edition should be superior to the one before it. And for D&D, in my opinion, for the most part, that has been true. Tell me your D&D pet peeves below. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.